That is the most important thing that's ever happened in blockchains because we are finally able to unite the collateral base on Bitcoin with the assurances that come with the rollup, with the programmability that empirically people want. And I think it throws the rest of the blockchain ecosystem into absolute chaos when Bitcoin does that and finally, reaches its destiny, which we've been waiting 15 years for.
Okay, we have the one and only Nic Carter. So there are a lot of things that I want to ask you about, and I'm not sure whether I should start with kind of your white pill moment with karate combat, some of your hot takes on Bitcoin culture, or this new concept I learned about called testicular torsion.
No, we're leaving the torsion. We're taking that one offline.
Yeah, we'll leave that as maybe an Easter egg where somebody can go and we'll see how effective the Twitter sleuths are with that.
There's another podcast where I discuss this concept, but I'm not going to tell you which one.
Okay, cool. So I really actually am curious. Like this happened 6 or 7 months ago, but your moment like karate combat, I saw the knockout, I saw the elation in your eyes, and I'm just kind of I'm curious to hear more about that. Both like how it felt going into fighting, whether you're going to have a second fight, and then maybe the underlying motive, like the white pill moment that you talked about on Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to fight because I really like combat sports as a fan, and I don't like being a fan of something without doing it, I mean, I guess that's the case for basically every fan. You don't have to know how to throw a football to like football, but I thought that there was something, potentially very transformative about actually getting into the octagon or the pit, as it were, and I wanted to test myself. And I've always been very fitness focused, but I knew that combat sports a different beast entirely, and that is true, man. The level of fitness and cardio you need and muscular endurance to do combat sports is unlike anything I've ever experienced. And the other reason I got into it was because I wrote this on Twitter, but I was diagnosed with Crohn's in January of last year, January 2024, and that was a really tough thing. It kind of reminded me of my mortality, and it was very difficult actually to deal with. And I had to stay out of the gym for a month or two as I dealt with that. And I was like, okay, well, I need a goal or an objective that'll get me back to peak fitness. And so I had known about karate combat because I'd been to some of the fights, actually through Tommy Shaughnessy, who's an investor in KC, and I'd been to some of the fights. It's funny, it's a fight promotion, but they've raised money from crypto investors. And so they reached out to me like, Nic, would you ever want to fight? We know that you're a fan. And I'm like, okay. And so then I asked David Hoffman if he would do it, and he said yes. Unfortunately, he got injured a week before the fight. Then we found another fight with Cody Kuhn for Nashville, and I did it. So I had done 2 training camps back to back at that point, and being a full-time venture capitalist and also trying to do a professional style training camp is a level of exhaustion I wouldn't wish on anyone. There's just no time or energy left over at the end of the day. And so part of the reason I was so excited when I got the knockout was not just, one thing I was worried about was being embarrassed in front of everybody that I knew. I knew that it would be a highlight reel that would haunt me for years on Twitter if I got knocked out. So I was glad that didn't happen. The other thing was just, it was the summation of at that point, 6 months of work, real hard work. And I was just, it was a very emotional moment. I'm like, wow, I set out to do this thing and I did it, and it's over. And I was also happy I didn't have to fight 2 more rounds because I was actually getting pretty tired. So that's why I look so excited.
Yeah. No, I really do think it was quite often. I felt like small little vibes, inspiration in myself. I'm curious, one, do you think a Hoffman fight will ever ensue, or do you think that's kind of long gone?
Well, I'm willing. I don't know if my body is able. Actually, I managed to herniate a disc, and I have another bulging disc. I overdid it basically in the training, and I'm not sure if that will get better. I don't want to go the Luigi route and get back surgery and then, end up, assassinating a healthcare CEO or something. But
Oh boy.
so I don't know if that will resolve.
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
slated to have a second fight in Singapore, a boxing match, and I wasn't able to do it. I was injured. And so I would love to fight Hoffman. He won his fight. He won a good fight against Kane. I think we're the same size, evenly matched, both 1-0. I don't know if he wants to fight. He has other hobbies like mountaineering and rock climbing and stuff. I think he gets more joy out of those. But yeah, I still train when I can. For me, it's about my body's ability to let me do this. So maybe that's God saying, "Don't fight anymore."
Yeah, interesting. Maybe you just ride up in the sunset, go off on a high, undefeated. I will say my last thing I'll say on this, like, have you ever seen the movie Gattaca?
Yeah, of course. It's a great film. Great film.
Gattaca is one of my all-time favorite films, and there were certain vibes of like, I don't know, you got this little diagnosis of Crohn's disease, and then you kind of like took it upon yourself to go out and train and fight. Like, it felt very kind of like Gattaca type vibes for me. Like, I love that scene in the movie where the guy's like, how did you do all of this? And he's like, well, I never saved anything for the swim back. They're playing that like game of chicken. And there is something about that, like, I don't want to like compare Crohn's disease or your autoimmune disease to something that's like a terminal illness that somebody's going to die in the next like 6 months or anything. But like, yeah, I just think that white pill moment, a lot of people, including myself, were like, fuck yeah, dude, like go get it. So that's the last thing I'll say on that.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah. I mean, you can literally just do things, I mean, the thing is, you can't literally just do things. I mean, the circumstances need to be right. Like, I was very lucky. I have the resources to like hire a top trainer, and I have the flexibility with my schedule to like work out 3 times a day. Probably I don't, to be honest. I had to be a little delinquent in my obligations. But yeah, if you really want to do something, you can do it. And it's just a matter of like removing the barriers that stop you doing that thing. And it actually really does transform your mentality and your mindset. Like, I'm much calmer. I think when you know that you are like able to hold your own in a fight, if it comes to that, which it never has for me, and hopefully never does. Like, I think you are a much more peaceful person fundamentally. And it just like gave me a completely different kind of confidence as well. So I thoroughly encourage anybody to do it. Not necessarily to like actually fight, but train combat sports. Can't recommend it enough.
Yeah, I love it. I feel like I'm doing like a Joe Rogan podcast right now.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's move on to the next thing. I was going to ask you about a lot of the cliche Bitcoin stuff, which I do want to talk about, but let's go off-road in a little bit. I know that you're deep into all the AI stuff. So tell me kind of like what's happening there, what's piquing your interest, and does this have any overlap with some of your prior interests?
Yeah, I got into AI through Bitcoin mining. I have been a big defender of Bitcoin mining in years past, and the AI debate is actually the exact same. Like, I still see threads about people using the exact same objections they had to Bitcoin mining regarding AI. Actually, it's intensifying. And it's like comes down to this like fundamental debate, like, should we let social considerations like overcome what the free market wants to do? So like, should there be a top-down determination of how energy or any kind of resource should be apportioned in society? So it's the exact same debate. And this is what I try to tell the AI people for years. Like, hey guys, the Bitcoin mining debate that you're not paying attention to, this is going to come to your shores. And it did. And so through my, like, I guess, advocacy for Bitcoin mining, I just felt very strongly about it. I ended up meeting these guys that were doing Ethereum mining, and we had total common cause because they hated proof of stake, as did I. And they were also very interested in the energy debate. And they were mining ETH out of their basement. It's a startup called Atlantic Crypto. I wrote them a check. This was my first ever angel check. They renamed themselves to CoreWeave, and they pivoted eventually as ETH went to proof of stake to doing AI data centers. And now CoreWeave is a multi-decabillion-dollar startup. They'll probably go public this year. They are a service provider for all the major, all the hyperscalers, all the major model companies, like anyone that's doing heavy-duty AI training and inference. Through them, they would periodically tell me like, hey, try out this app. Like, and this was in 2018, 2019. They'd be like, hey, try out this like text-based adventure game app. And it was like GPT-2 wrapper, you know? And so I realized fairly early on that like LLMs were just like the most incredible technology. And so I started paying more and more attention to it. Now it's like a big part of my time and attention. Uh, Even though like the crypto AI stuff, I haven't found any like interesting nexus there whatsoever. But I was just, sometimes like life takes you down these weird paths, and it's like me caring about the Bitcoin mining energy debate led me to learn a lot about AI. And I mean, it's the most important phenomenon in the world today. I mean, crypto is very important, but AI is bigger. It will it'll have a bigger impact on society, I think. And so through that, I've been following the DeepSeek conversation very closely. It's absolutely fascinating. But yeah, it's a incredible sector, and I don't think you can ignore it. Even if you just care about crypto, I think it's like we're witnessing a second industrial revolution, basically.
Okay, so a bunch of stuff that I want to tap into here. One, like for those that don't know, explain this kind of DeepSeek versus GPU stuff that's been going on for probably a month or so now, but like really kind of heated up this week.
Yeah, I mean, basically this like HFT out of China as a quote unquote side project, that's what they claimed, developed a model that performs at parity with the best frontier models from OpenAI, except they claim that they only spent $5 million to train it, whereas we know OpenAI is spending $100 million to train their state-of-the-art models. It's an open source model. OpenAI is not, ironically enough. And so you were able to check DeepSeek's work and see that probably because they had lesser access to high-end chips due to the export restrictions, they were able to find fundamental speed-ups and just improvements in the LLM architecture. And so it looks like inference costs, as in like when you send a query to the model that's inference, are down by a factor of 30 to 50 maybe, compared with the state-of-the-art. And it looks like the training cost is also like vastly reduced, although we don't know the exact numbers there. There's some debate around that. And the improvements they found, the speed ups and efficiencies are real. Like anybody can check that for themselves. So this is like a total narrative violation in like 10 different ways. One, like months ago, there's this paper by Leopold Aschenbrenner. Did you encounter that? It was like the $1 trillion cluster or something. So the prevailing view in the West was like, because the scaling law exists where you feed more data and more compute to the model, you get a better model on kind of a linear basis. QED, we should scale up the amount of resources and CapEx as much as we possibly can to get AGI. And it's just a matter of resources in, model quality out. So that's why you got ideas around the $1 trillion cluster. Like just last week, Sam Altman announces a $500 billion facility, a joint venture with Microsoft and Oracle to build data centers. So in the West, the idea was capital investment will equal supremacy. That has been undermined significantly. It's clear that there's like fundamental speedups that are possible so that this law doesn't necessarily apply. The other orthodox belief was OpenAI has some kind of secret sauce. They're just fundamentally better than everyone. They are the best model. They're going to stay the best. That was undermined. The other narrative violation is China. Like apparently China has cutting edge AI developers. Like we didn't realize this. We thought America was the center of innovation there. That's apparently not true anymore. This is a team no one had ever heard of. They were running a quant fund, and in their free time, they came out with like this incredible bleeding edge model, and then they open sourced it. That's another narrative violation. And so all these things are like incredible whipsaw effect. And now everyone started panicking about NVIDIA. Like, will the hyperscalers continue to buy tens of billions of dollars of chips a year from NVIDIA? Maybe not. Maybe you'll be able to run inference on these models on the edge, right? Because like the prevailing view was edge compute doesn't work for AI. You have to send your queries off to a gigantic data center in Abilene, Texas, where they will run it on a cluster of 32,000 or 64,000 H200s or whatever it is. Maybe with a better, more efficient model like we're getting out of DeepSeek, you can run it on your MacBook locally. So in computing, there's always like this oscillation between edge compute and centralized compute. DeepSeek is pushing us more towards the edge, which probably undermines the hypothesis, the value prop of someone like NVIDIA that makes these industrial chips. So incredible development. But I think we're obligated to talk about the Jevons paradox as well here. So
Yeah. So really quickly, just so I make sure I understand, like from a very naive perspective, it was kind of like the way to improve these models is just brute force, buy as much hardware as you can, like build the cluster and just like throw a bunch of, hardware and energy at this. But you're saying this DeepSeek thing took an alternative approach where, I don't know, is it fair to say it's like improving the software or the algorithm side versus like the hardware? Is that like a very naive way to understand this? And then if so, then go ahead and start explaining kind of Jevons paradox and your take there.
yeah, so that's absolutely right. Basically, Chinese teams are constrained. They don't have access to the best hardware in theory, although actually, as it turns out, NVIDIA probably is delivering a lot of their hardware to China via Singapore. Apparently 20% of NVIDIA sales go through Singapore. So that's kind of like how a lot of European exports go to Kyrgyzstan and Central Asian countries in order to go to Russia now, post the sanctions. It's the same thing, basically. And so, yeah, this team, necessity is the mother of invention. The team was able to find like fundamental improvements in how these models are trained and simplifications that it's kind of like a real lesson. It's like the Western teams had access to basically unlimited hardware and compute, and they weren't forced to be parsimonious with how they were designing and training the models. And so when a constraint was imposed, fundamental improvements were found, which is kind of like a great little case study. And so now the question for capital markets is, well, is the world going to spend as much on compute as we thought they would, both on the training and the inference side? Or did compute get so much cheaper, AI compute, in order to receive the same output, that we just don't need as much capital investment? And is that bad for NVIDIA? Is it bad for the CoreWeaves of the world? Is it bad for all those companies? And I think the answer is no. Jevons paradox, I know people are sick of hearing about it, but it's actually relevant in the blockchain context too. That's when I first learned about it, because it totally applies to block space, by the way, which we should definitely talk about. I think the Jevon guy, whoever he is, Mr. Jevon, it was an economist in the Industrial Revolution who realized that as coal got cheaper, we used more coal. So that totally makes sense. It's kind of like aluminum. Like aluminum was this like super elite metal that in the Napoleonic era, like you would make your cutlery and silverware out of aluminum because it was so scarce and hard to refine with the technology at the time. And then it became much cheaper to extract it from bauxite, and now everything's made of aluminum. So the net amount of demand for aluminum increased it's like an obvious point. It's not even a paradox. It's just a supply demand curve, right? So the same was true with coal. Like it became cheaper to extract coal. The world used a lot more coal because it was more abundant. We developed industrial uses for it. It's the same with AI compute, I would assume, and I believe. As AI inference, the commodity of artificial intelligence becomes cheaper, it will be incorporated into everything. It's being used in this podcast right now, most likely, either for transcription or for making slight tweaks to the way we look in real time or the background that you're using, right? Everyone will be using AI all the time in consumer applications. And so, if it becomes 50 times cheaper to run a query from OpenAI or anywhere else, like we'll all probably just use a lot more of it. So I think, the total quantity of compute demanded is going to vastly increase as it's now become significantly cheaper. So I think that undermines the bear case for all of these AI stocks, basically.
So essentially, I think the position is that look, there is an insatiable demand for what's happening with AI. And it doesn't matter if we improve the inference or the training or whatever, it's like more. Like we will just take on more. Like that is kind of the crux of Jevons paradox. It says it doesn't matter like how much you unrestrict this, like we will consume it.
And also, the world's a dynamic place, and as you make a commodity cheaper, new uses become economical that maybe weren't economical before. So it actually creates more usage modes. So the price of the commodity, the way that we interact with the commodity is not fixed. So now there's just cheaper, more abundant AI. So AI will be more ubiquitous. We'll find more better use cases for it.
Okay. And so you said this kind of also relates to like, blockchains and block space, maybe like tie that parallel together.
Yeah, so this is a great example of the Jevons paradox. So I guess there's this view that, so in the Bitcoin land, we like to think that block space is scarce, or at least we did historically, right? And there is the constraint on block space, which is we in Bitcoin land want to keep running a node relatively cheap to keep the security guarantees of the network stable. We want people to be able to verify what's happening on chain, and so we deliberately keep block space scarce. If you create more block space, a lot of Bitcoiners, like the small blocker ideology was, well, we can just we don't need to create more block space. We can constrain it. I'm actually curious to see where you fall on this debate as well in the context of L2s. The orthodox Bitcoin view is, well, we should keep block space scarce, and then the most economically dense use cases will fill it. And that's how you get the high fee environment, which in theory is what you want. But then there's also the empirical fact that blockchains that made block space super abundant, like let's say Solana, that created new usage modes because fees weren't a constraint anymore. So now you have like very active DeFi and meme coin trading, for better or for worse, on Solana. And so you unlock these new usage modes as you make the commodity cheaper. I don't know what the implication there is for fees. I think at the end of the day, it's probably a race to the bottom with fees. But the way that block space works, I think also illustrates the Jevons paradox, which is as you create more of it and becomes cheaper, people find new ways to utilize it, and the demand therefore increases. And that's why even though Solana probably offers 500 to 1,000 times more block space per unit time than Bitcoin, it's still full because people found new ways to like deal with the blockchain, basically.
Yeah, I have a bunch of hot takes here. One is, did you actually see Luke Jr.'s poll this morning about like,
Oh, I missed it.
he's floating the idea of a proposal in June or July to lower the block space to 300 kilobytes.
Oh yeah, he's still trying to do that.
Yeah. So, I don't think that'll ever happen, but I do have some hot takes on block space, especially in the context of like what we're building with Alpin with ZK rollups. I mean, there's really kind of like two components of scaling blockchains. There's the execution, and then there's the data side. And like zero knowledge proofs can compress the execution. So we could take any arbitrary amount of execution, whether that's like, Solidity language or, Pyro or the SVM or whatever, and we can compress it. And like that, you can get a full 100% compression nearly. But like, yeah, the data side, we can't necessarily compress. So like, even with something like zero knowledge rollups as a scaling solution for Bitcoin, like there are limitations around the size of the block space. And I think to your point, what I think will end up happening is I just compare it to like, if we're the L2 and we're opening up all these new applications on top of the ZK rollup, we're essentially going to be pouring water into the L1 bucket, and we're going to fill up those kind of 4 megabyte blocks as much as we possibly can. And then once you start getting overflow, the water will kind of flow out into these, alternative DA solutions, maybe something like a Celestia or an off-chain DA. And naturally, the higher value transactions will find their way to the Bitcoin L1 with like the highest trust assumptions, but you'll also have the opportunity to kind of like have this Jevons paradox type thing that you're talking about, where it's like, for maybe lower value transactions or transactions that don't need that base layer of security, you have that kind of unbounded scale on the DA side. And I actually think that this is a pretty good solution because it gives people the opportunity to get the absolute best level of trust assumptions without us having to necessarily increase the block size, and while still making sure that the Bitcoin security budget is secured. Because if we did like, let's even assume that increasing the block size, it didn't sacrifice, decentralization, and everybody could still run a node. Like, we could all run, 10 gigabyte, blocks, like nodes. Let's assume that like didn't sacrifice decentralization. There still is something to be said of like, we need the Bitcoin security budget to be able to stand on its own 2 feet without tail emissions. And so there is an argument, even aside from decentralization, that we need to keep the L1 blocks like semi-constrained, so the fees will start going up, and miners can start making more money outside of the Coinbase. And I think if you look at the numbers of, if these Bitcoin rollups get any amount of usage, miners are going to become like obscenely rich, like sickeningly rich. And like,
That's good though.
You run the numbers, and it's
want.
like, I tell somebody, and I'm like, we're going to increase this by like, I don't want to sound too brazen, but like 10, maybe even 100x or more. And they're like, what?
Yeah, the block space is not an ordinary commodity. You're exactly right. I mean, there's the two constraints. One is security, like people have to be able to run nodes. That's what Bitcoiners have historically cared about. And then there's economic security, which is the miners need to be paid. And so you can't just increase it unilaterally forever, because there's the negative externality that miners still need to be paid and security needs to be ensured. So it is not an ordinary commodity. And I mean, I gave a talk at MIT in 2018, maybe 2019, MIT Bitcoin Expo. And I, like many Bitcoiners, believed in the layered model. And I kind of sketched out this idea of like, oh, okay, let's make the Bitcoin base layer economically dense by layering on. Many Bitcoiners have believed in this, obviously, but I wasn't a big believer in Lightning. Still not. I think time has confirmed that. And I laid out all these other possible like second layers that could, dramatically enhance usage while also, remanding fees to the base layer. But it was like totally speculative at that time. And I think what's changed is now technologically it's more tractable to have rollups on Bitcoin finally. And so that's totally assuaged my concerns about the economic security of Bitcoin, especially as I've realized how much data something like an Alpin would actually require from the L1. So I feel so much better about it now than I did like 5 years ago. I was very concerned about it.
Yeah. I tend to agree. I think that we were kind of like hand waving it away, or I'd say the broader community was, like several years ago. But now when people bring it, I'm like, oh, you are definitely living in the past. And I even think that we're kind of seeing people recognize this. Like, one of the outspoken critics of the Bitcoin security budget was Hasu. Hasu was like, he is an extremely well-respected researcher. And he kind of like left Bitcoin because he felt like everybody was ignoring it. And now Hasu's back. Like he's one of our angel investors in Alpin. Like, we're stoked to have him. And I think that's an indication that this Overton window around the security budget and like the capabilities of Bitcoin is changing.
Yeah, I was concerned about it too. I never left Bitcoin. Some people maybe accuse me of having left Bitcoin, but I thought it was one of those things that we weren't allowed to talk about for some reason. Like, it was a forbidden topic, the security budget. And Bitcoiners had all these like magical beliefs about it. I don't know. Like somehow Lightning would save us, and there was never any real discussion of it even. And I even proposed some like very heretical things, like the coin recycling idea. I'm sure you've encountered this, which people really hate that, or altruistic mining, or like moving to backdoor proof of stake basically is, look, we don't really want to do any of those things, to be honest. It'd be better if just the market found a way to solve it. And ever since BitVM, basically, it became clear to me that there would actually be a market-driven technological resolution, which is very, very encouraging.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, so we're talking a little bit about like Bitcoin culture here, which I think will be a fun one. So you recently said the hardest part about being a Bitcoiner is that you're in the trade with a lot of delusional people. Maybe what did you mean by that? And
Yeah, it really is, because it's like you're long Bitcoin intellectually and financially, and Bitcoin culture becomes seized by these mass delusions from time to time. And one of them is, in my opinion, the strategic Bitcoin reserve right now. Like, I remember when Bitcoin was not Like we weren't like pleading with state power to like make Bitcoin win, right? Like we had this more oppositional stance to the state, and it does seem like an abdication of that to now appeal to the government to buy Bitcoin. And a lot of it's couched in this like ostensibly altruistic claim that like the U.S. government buying Bitcoin is good for the U.S. government. I just, first of all, I think it's ridiculous that Bitcoiners want the U.S. government to buy Bitcoin. And second of all, I think the claim that it's good for the U.S. government is just plainly not true. So I think it actually undermines the nature of the dollar. Any other government, fine. Like they are not the issuers of the global reserve currency. Like global capital markets don't depend on them, but in the U.S. we do issue the global reserve, and so I won't get too much into this. But anyway, I think it's ridiculous, and it's odd that this became totally conventional wisdom in Bitcoin land, that an SBR was a good idea, one, and two, that it was likely. Like it's not likely. In fact, I have put the probability at 0.01% that it happens. So that's like just the latest incarnation of popular delusion, which has seized the Bitcoin community. And I don't know what it is about Bitcoin that encourages such magical thinking, but it happens from time to time. Like previously, there was the stock to flow model. This is another example. It's like this model was sketched out, which is just basically drawing a kind of like basic exponent or like a simple regression on Bitcoin price regressing against time. And when people felt this was like a mathematical or like almost like a law of physics, like some sort of like mathematical regularity, which ensured that the Bitcoin price would have to go up forever a ton, like a huge amount. It's like, that's not how finance or markets works. There's not these laws of physics that determine price action. That's a complete violation of everything we know about markets. And yet Bitcoiners were absolutely convinced that this stock to flow model was true and the Bitcoin price was in some way preordained. That was another example. I mean, I'm sure there's more, and I'm sure there will be more in the future. So I like quietly suffer, these things because it leads to this like total overzealousness in the Bitcoin community, and we got ahead of ourselves. We basically incorporate into the price the expectation of these things being true, like the SBR. When it became clear that an SBR was actually not going to happen, Bitcoin sold off. Actually, I think it was the day I gave that interview where I said that I was in the trade with delusional people. That was the absolute top tick on that day. I'm not saying I did that, but I think this is part of what leads to the boom bust to a certain extent, is people get way over their skis on these ideas that think are true when they're revealed to not be true. There's mass disillusionment, and that affects the price. So it's just totally unnecessary. Like I wish we could just be more sensible about this thing.
Yeah, it was really interesting to me how far of a reach like the stock to flow model and really the Eric Wall's rainbow chart made it. I had an extremely credible friend of mine. I mean, he worked at Google and Apple, and like I consider him like an authority on many things. And he's like, yeah, like I'm a fan of this like rainbow chart. I'm like, what? And I had to explain to him that it was a parody, that it was all a joke. The other thing, so kind of like on this SBR and like the number go up cult, I feel in many ways a huge part of the community has essentially sold their soul for number go up. And to some extent, I'm sympathetic to that. Like I'm not naive to number go up makes a lot of people come in. But do you have fears of like what the long-term implications are that if all we want is number go up, and that the people that make number go up are big institutions and Sailor and nation states. And those entities, like anybody else, they have their own motives and their own incentives. And maybe they don't want to see, non-custodial solutions built on Bitcoin because they want to control the flow. Like they want to provide the custody and extract fees. And maybe they don't want to see things like privacy because they want to be, part of the surveillance state. That is a tension that I feel, where I want number go up like everybody else, but at what cost? At what point are we selling our soul of kind of like why we're here? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I straddle this and struggle with it too, because part of what I do is like invest in the institutionalization of Bitcoin, right? Whether that's custody or execution or clearing or prime or, you know, startups and companies that will make Bitcoin more easily ingested by institutions, large pools of capital, sovereigns one day. So that's what my fund does. There's always a tension there because at the same time, I believe in Bitcoin, like the pure vision of Bitcoin that's not captured by institutions. I think Bitcoin can well resist these things. It has proven able to do that. And frankly, I thought that institutional capture would be most likely if we did not solve the security budget issue. So if there was a crisis, then I thought there was a real potential for institutional capture, but the largest firms that had a stake in Bitcoin would start to take responsibility for its security. And at that point, they would be impossible to kind of like disentangle. We wouldn't be able to de-risk from them, if that makes sense. So on the one hand, I think we've done a good job in resisting institutional capture. But on the other, it's like very much a careful what you wish for kind of thing. Like, let's say Bitcoiners do convince the US government that an SBR is a good idea, and the government, this isn't going to happen, but let's say it did happen. The government becomes totally adamant that they need a reserve of Bitcoin. The government has a lot of ways to get that Bitcoin, which aren't just buying it on the open market like Saylor does. They have a monopoly on violence in this country. When the US government wanted a lot of gold in the 30s, they didn't just freely buy it on the open market. They made private ownership of gold illegal. They at first asked people nicely to sell their gold to them at a fixed price, and then they compelled them to do that, right? So there's a number of different ways the government could acquire the Bitcoin more cheaply than just buying it, and they could certainly do that. I'm not saying that's the political environment we're in. We don't have FDR today. State power isn't what it was. It's not as centralized today as it was in the 30s and 40s, but if there is some kind of crisis and the government decides at all costs they need to acquire 1 million Bitcoins, there's a lot of different ways for them to get it, and a lot of those ways are not ways that Bitcoiners would like. So I think it really is a careful you wish for. I don't think we need to impress upon the government the importance of acquiring Bitcoin. And if they ever do want it, that would be something that would terrify me rather than make me excited.
Well, okay, so let's say at this point in time, you're kind of like taking this position against an SBR or governments acquiring Bitcoin, but is there any standard where you say maybe at this point, okay, like I'm fine with governments acquiring it, or if we had this level of functionality, or is it a perpetual no, like this is a non-government movement, they should never have it? Like what changes your position here?
Yeah, I mean, foreign governments, I think, totally within their rights to try and acquire Bitcoin. Some of them already doing this. Bhutan and El Salvador are the ones we know of. There's probably others. For the global reserve issuer, aka us, it's a much more complex question, I think. The moment the US government says we are acquiring Bitcoin to reduce our dependence on the dollar, that is very concerning. I mean, I think that would shake confidence in the dollar. Some Bitcoiners want that. They're accelerationists. They want to accelerate the demise of the dollar so we can transcend the dollar system and, you know, move into this utopian world where Bitcoin is the numeraire for everything, and it's the unit of account, it's the SOV, it's the MIOE. But I think that transition would be incredibly disruptive and chaotic. So I don't think it makes sense for the US government to do that. Other governments, other types of entities, fine. If they want Bitcoin, that's fine. Also, like, we don't have to do it today. So the US government has the ability to acquire Bitcoin easily if it wants. Most Bitcoin is custodied here, or at least a plurality of it. Certainly we're the global nexus of Bitcoin adoption. All the big custodians, most of the trading activity, et cetera, like a lot of Americans hold Bitcoin. If the US government ever wants the Bitcoin, it can freely do that, it has that option. So I don't think we need to trigger the option today. If in 10 or 20 years, Bitcoin has actually monetized to being a global monetary commodity similar to gold, which is worth, I don't know, $18, $19 trillion as of today. Say Bitcoin does 10x and it reaches that scale. then I think we can start to have a conversation. Okay, maybe we are going to reinstate a neo gold standard, backed partially or fully by Bitcoin. But I don't think the time is right to do that.
Okay. And so you kind of alluded to this, but how do you see Bitcoin playing out? Like, do you buy into the hyper Bitcoinization thesis where, unit of account, medium of exchange, all of that? Or is it more of, maybe like a multipolar world? Like, what do you expect and maybe what would you hope for?
Yeah, I mean, I think Bitcoin is not going to be a medium of exchange. I think this should be clear. This has been clear to me since about 2020. If you just look at the data, people prefer to use stablecoins, right? And so we should all have made our peace with that already. People do not want to use a volatile uh, currency, I guess you can call it whatever. They don't want to use a volatile asset as their medium of exchange for clear, obvious reasons, and then also for tax reasons, because right now it's treated like a capital gain when you hold it and then you sell it in order to buy something, right? So there's a tax drag that's incorporated into every single transaction. So it's just not going to be used as an MOE, both theoretically and then empirically. Look on chain. Look at this data. I've been publishing this data for years. Something like 70-80% of all settlement value on blockchains occurs in stablecoin format, dollar stablecoins. And stablecoins have a far higher velocity than native crypto assets like Bitcoin or ETH. So from the MOE perspective, that battle's lost. That doesn't mean that Bitcoin can't benefit from the usage of stablecoins. That is a discussion we need to have. Like, how do we, align the interests of the stablecoin sector and Bitcoin? Right now, stablecoin usage trades off against Bitcoin, I would say, because mostly it's happening on Ethereum, Tron, BSC, and Solana. So is there a way to insert these stablecoins onto Bitcoin L2s and have it ultimately benefit the Bitcoin space? Hopefully that can happen. I'd be disappointed if it didn't. But in terms of the SOV discussion, I think Bitcoin is well on its way to being like a global monetary asset of consequence. That cat is out of the bag. That's going to continue regardless. And ultimately over the next 2 decades, I think it matches gold, which would be like the destination of choice, I think.
Okay. I tend to agree with you that store of value is pretty well established. Like, we are on the brink of a global sovereign debt crisis. Like, there is definitively, product market fit there. The whole medium of exchange, unit of account, I do agree that stable coins are similarly looking like the winner there. So you've written a ton, as you kind of were alluding to, on this like crypto dollarization and this kind of proliferation of stable coins everywhere. Do you have any opinions on Bitcoin-backed stablecoins as opposed to fiat-backed stablecoins? Because when you talk about stablecoins, it's usually in the context of, naturally so, the centralized, treasury-backed stablecoins.
Yeah, I mean, if you kind of want to match the asset and the liability, so you can do a crypto-backed stablecoin, but so like Maker or Dai was the original version of this, right? It actually wasn't the first, but I think BitShares was probably the first. But so you can do a stablecoin where you hold some amount of Bitcoin in collateral. You issue dollars against that. You have to over reserve it, so it's obviously capital inefficient. And then you have some kind of risk management where you change the collateral limits in response to the price action in Bitcoin. That's certainly doable. But that experiment has been running for years and never received real traction. I mean, if I had to guess, like in the stablecoin sector, I think 95% is fiat backed, conventional fiat backed. The other way to do it against Bitcoin collateral is something like Athena, which it sterilizes the risk of Bitcoin with an offsetting short position. So you have a long spot position, a short futures position, and then as a bonus, you collect the spread between the futures and the spot. And often, the futures are trading at a premium to the spot, and so there's a quote unquote yield that's derived from that. That's a $5-6 billion asset. Stablecoins overall are $200 billion, and that one's also bounded by the size of that trade, which is maybe 20 to 30 billion. So that one also has real scalability issues, and also the yields come down as you create more of the synthetic dollar. So that one also doesn't scale indefinitely. The thing that does scale basically indefinitely is an on-chain tokenized dollar liability that's backed by treasuries. So in the past, I was probably more optimistic about the possibility to create Bitcoin-backed stablecoins. In the present, I think it's going to be the conventional model of stables that are established and work. And I think the question is, like, how do we arrange that system such that it benefits Bitcoin, Bitcoin security, Bitcoin network, demand for block space, etc. And I think that just means putting these conventional fiat-backed stablecoins onto Bitcoin L2s. I think that's the way to do it.
Yeah, I think I might have a different take than here. This is like a topic that I'm, pretty fired up about. I think Athena is like a very compelling model, but you do have to use a custodian essentially, where you put it in something like Copper, and then they trade on the centralized perpetuals exchanges, which is understandable because they have deep enough liquidity. Hopefully, in the future, like some of these L2s will become so performant, you can have app-specific chains and modify all the parameters, and you can truly compete on par with some of the centralized exchanges. Maybe then we can actually run perpetuals with deep enough liquidity to where you don't need the custodian. So there might be a path there to recreate something like Athena actually in a credibly decentralized way. On the maker side, I tend to agree with you, but like there are these kind of what I'll call like next generation versions of Maker that have really, like, I think, taken that code, forked it, and then made improvements to it. Like a classic, like I think the main one people think of is Liquidity, or Liquidity V2, which just dropped this like past week. And I think that's a model that's proven to be much more collateral efficient, where you can have like no upgradability of the protocol, and so you can truly have like a credibly censorship resistant stablecoin that doesn't have any human governance or need to adjust the parameters as interest rates go up or down. And that type of stablecoin, I think, is like incredibly based. And I would argue that like something like censorship resistance, it really, like, people diminish it and kind of take away from it. But much of the entire Eurodollar system, like our entire financial system, was really born out of this desire to kind of have these like offshore, unregulated, dollar value. And everybody says, oh, wow, look at like stablecoins like Tether, like these things are offshore and unregulated. It's like, no, they're not. Like everybody knows Howard Lutnick custodies everything. Like if Tether does like actively censor and freeze things, but in reality, like the Eurodollar system was born out of the desire of these kind of like rogue nations like Russia, who wanted access to these dollars that would otherwise have been like regulated. And so I think that the kind of catalyst for all of these dollar markets are born out of this desire to have stable dollar value that has censorship resistance. And if you can create a credible Bitcoin-backed stablecoin, which is collateral efficient and is credibly censorship resistant, I think that there is a niche market there that could really take off. And maybe that this is a dangerous thing to say, but arguably one of the reasons why privacy really hasn't taken off is there's no way to do stable privacy. Like how do you put a stable coin into something like Monero or Zcash? Like you can't. As soon as the dollars go into the shielded pool, they're censored. And so I think this is a use case that actually has credible product market fit that maybe we could be seeing in the next couple of years that could take off. Curious if you think I'm incorrect.
No, I'm excited for those experiments too. I think there's basically this interplay between Bitcoin and stablecoins where you're right, there's like a continuum of censorship resistance and volatility on the one side, and then a lack of censorship resistance and stability on the other. And what I think is going to happen is, I do think there will be attempts to recreate Maker on Bitcoin. I think they'll have some traction. But what I think really is going to happen is there will be continued aggression against the stablecoins from the like regulatory powers that be, because stablecoins are fairly unrestricted right now. I mean, of course, you can go to Tether and ask them to freeze an address, and they do it fairly often. I mean, they've probably frozen about 1,000, maybe a couple thousand addresses all time. That's very different from how banks work, of course. So it's still a very light touch approach for stablecoins. If it ever is the case that, whether it's Treasury or the DOJ or FATA for BIS or any of these transnational agencies that are concerned with AML and financial crime, if they ever decide that they don't like the way that stablecoins work, which is very plausible to me, there could be a move back towards just using Bitcoin. And so, if like the fundamental blacklist-based model of stablecoins becomes politically untenable, then it'd be like, okay, well, let's just use Bitcoin instead. Now that this infrastructure is established and set up, so I think there'll be like a cyclic nature to this system where people become maybe disillusioned with stablecoins as they become more censored, or as governments ask more and more of the issuers, and people lose some trust in that system, come back to Bitcoin. Then maybe there's the counter movement where, okay, now we're all using Bitcoin. Well, we want to try and do stablecoins again. So like this constant tug of war is the way I see it going.
Okay. Interesting perspective there. So the next thing I want to talk about is these kind of like BitVM2 style rollups, if you want to call them ZK rollups, kind of what we're working on at Alpin. Like, what's your opinion on them? And for context, you guys at Castle Island, like you are an investor. You were actually in our seed round in Alpin. And so maybe you can also give perspective of like why you guys invested in this space and in Alpin whenever that happened, like a year and a half ago, before BitVM even existed, before we knew that we could verify zero knowledge proofs optimistically on Bitcoin. Like, what was your rationale there, and why did you take that risk?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, you're right. I guess I should pat myself on the back or something, because that was before BitVM came out, which was the big unlock. It was the Roger Bannister running the 4-minute mile kind of thing that opened the Overton window and made people realize that maybe native rollups are possible on Bitcoin. And so we just had felt that L2s would exist and rollups would exist on Bitcoin for a long time. And all of the L2s on Bitcoin were like pretty centralized. I mean, Liquid, for instance, or incredibly complex and capital inefficient like Lightning. And we were pitched so many Lightning startups, and the architecture didn't appeal to me. And so I felt there was just inexorable march towards a better kind of an L2, most likely borrowing from the architectures that had become popular on Ethereum. Like there used to be this view in the Bitcoin community that we would fold in the best technologies from elsewhere into Bitcoin, and then we just got away from that. And so I thought that it would happen because it had to happen, basically. I didn't know how it would happen exactly, but I was looking for the entrepreneurs that would be able to do it. And with Alpin, I put my faith in Sims and the team. I thought they were by far the best technical team I'd ever encountered in the Bitcoin L2 space. And they're coming at it with a fresh set of eyes too. Like they weren't beholden to the orthodoxy. I think that's very important. Like a lot of the builders in Bitcoin at the time were like, yeah, we're just going to build on Lightning, and we're going to like fix the kinks with Lightning. I didn't believe in that. I thought a new architecture was warranted. And I didn't know why we were shying away from trying to look at some of the true innovations that had actually succeeded in Ethereum land. I think it was just like an ideological thing that Bitcoin developers refused to even consider what had happened in Ethereum with the plasma to rollups to like true rollups transition. Bitcoiners weren't even monitoring that. They weren't aware of it. And when Sims told me, we think we can do this on Bitcoin, we don't know how yet, we're going to figure it out, I was like, I believe you. And then as it turns out, Robin came out with BitVM. But I thought that there was like a sense of inevitability to it. So I wasn't really that surprised when Robin came out with the paper. It's like, okay, I didn't know how it was going to happen, but I had a feeling it was going to happen because it had to. Because I thought it was existential for Bitcoin. $1 trillion are at risk. Okay, someone's going to figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so biased in saying this, but I just think what is happening is the single most exciting thing going on in our industry. And I think right now people are like, oh, cool, this is kind of cute. Like you can create these like, like L2s on top of Bitcoin. They're kind of like quasi rollups. And I think once people see where these things go, where maybe it extends beyond the EVM, maybe it extends beyond like the Bitcoin block space. Maybe you can have things like instant pre-confirmations and trustless interoperability. And all of a sudden you're looking at this and saying, wow, like, do I want to go over into Ethereum's modular ecosystem? Or do I want to have all that same functionality essentially at parity, but get trustless access to the trillions of dollars of BTC collateral with like the established product market fit and use case, which is monetary premium. And I
Yeah.
think that's going to break a lot of people's brains when they are like, whoa, like, wait, why am I not on Bitcoin?
Yeah, this actually solves, or this addresses the biggest problem in the blockchain space, which is that when you create a new religion, you end up not being able to hold the center. Like, so Catholicism is internally consistent. I promise that I'm going to I'll get to a point here. Like, Catholicism is internally consistent. Protestantism, when, Martin Luther and the Protestants broke off from the Catholic Church, then they ended up like splintering a zillion times, right? Like, there's one Catholic Church and there's like a trillion different Protestant denominations, right? This happens with blockchains too, because everybody wants to be progressive. Everybody wants to start their own thing. Nobody wants to be beholden to like the orthodoxy, unless there's like a very strong commitment to doing that, as there is in Bitcoin. So Vitalik created Ethereum. Okay, what he did was like violate the narrative that we should just have one blockchain. Okay, so then Anatoly was like, well, like, I want to make these changes to Ethereum the way Vitalik did to Bitcoin, right? And so we're going to create Solana. And then you have Avalanche and Ripple and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this like constant churn outside of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is Bitcoin. And then outside of Bitcoin, there's this like never ending churn where entrepreneurs are like, okay, this blockchain's okay, but like maybe let's make these couple tweaks. And then the developers like, all right, well, Ethereum's like kind of well trodden ground. I think I have more opportunity to build on this new blockchain. So like a never ending churn, which is really bad for a financial network, right? You don't have like Visa and then new Visa and then new Visa. Like, you don't have to constantly rip and replace your financial infrastructure. So in like crypto, we have the opposite problem from TradFi, which is TradFi, we have like these settlement infrastructures that are decades and decades old, like ACH, like that's even predating the internet, the way it works. It's like these file transfer protocols that are like incredibly outdated and obsolete, but everyone's stuck on them. In crypto, it's the opposite problem, is that everyone's trying to constantly refresh their infrastructure because like now there's a new blockchain, there's a new blockchain, there's a new blockchain. And so Ethereum is like previously was the real contender there. And now they're being seriously challenged by a bunch of other new contenders that are more nimble, more centralized, and they can compete on the same dimensions that Ethereum initially competed with Bitcoin on. And what Ethereum lacks is the monetary premium, even though many Ethereum influencers insisted that it existed. It doesn't have that because it doesn't have the credibility, the neutrality. Just recently, Vitalik admitted he's like in charge of the whole Ethereum Foundation. I don't know why he admitted that, but he did. He's like behaving a little bit like a dictator right now. Bitcoin doesn't have that. We've suffered all of our civil wars. Like, we've taken our licks because we have rejected this top-down governance model in pursuit of being like truly decentralized, truly neutral. Ethereum was this place to make richer, to have rich state, right? It was the place. Now maybe it's Solana. Tomorrow, maybe it's Barachain, like who knows? And so, but what's evident is that there's interesting stuff to do on blockchains that's not just holding your coins and looking at them jealously, right? There are stablecoins. There is DeFi. Somewhere needs to be the venue for that. The point is that taking the like Rollups architecture from Ethereum, putting them on Bitcoin, finally, for the first time, unites the dominant venue for liquidity and the most credible monetary network that exists in blockchains, and the only credible one that will ever exist, with this desire to have rich state. And that's the first time that it's been possible. So I completely share your view that what has happened since BitVM, since I guess, was it in 23 that it first came out?
I think like December of 23, but yeah, the
Late
majority of it's in
23.
24.
That is the most important thing that's ever happened in blockchains because we are finally able to unite the collateral base on Bitcoin with the assurances that come with the rollup with the programmability that empirically people want. And I think it throws the rest of the blockchain ecosystem into absolute chaos when Bitcoin does that and like finally, reaches its destiny, which we've been waiting 15 years for.
Yeah, I totally feel I feel like this is the child of prophecy. Like this is the implicit promise that was made to us that, we would add this functionality and this scalability to Bitcoin. And now it's like in Game of Thrones when Jon Snow is the prince that was promised. I feel like that's somewhat what is happening.
It was an
Uh,
explicit promise. It was an
yeah.
explicit promise. Like the early stewards of Bitcoin told us that they would do this, and then it didn't happen. We got sidetracked with Lightning. We had our like civil wars, and we forgot somewhere along the way that it wasn't just about script. We forgot that it wasn't just about like holding your coins, and that there's like more to do on blockchains. And then it became so abundantly clear we had no choice but to try and figure out how to do it, and we're on the cusp of that now.
So a lot of what you're talking about, I mentioned this to you before. Like one of my favorite pieces that you've ever written is this like, Bitcoin at 12 piece back in 2020. And you mentioned in that piece, you kind of kick off with like Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. And you talk about how Bitcoin is this like great cathedral and it will, like live beyond you. And so I'm curious, maybe if you could extend like why you wrote that and if you still feel the same way. And then lastly, it is kind of like, do you still feel that you are kind of part of like building that Bitcoin cathedral? Or honestly, do you feel that you kind of said what you needed to say and now it is time for the building of the cathedral to go beyond your side?
Yeah, I mean, I was one of like the early, I guess, not even that early, like stonemasons. Like I put a couple bricks in the cathedral, maybe. And now there's much more capable artisans such as yourself that are actually, figuring out like the stained glass windows and things like that, and the detailed whatever bas reliefs, like the details of the cathedral, and the struts and the ceiling and things like that. So my view is that I thought this when the Bitcoin ETF came out. Like I thought that I had done my bit basically. Like I don't even know what I did. I guess I just talked about Bitcoin a lot for a long time. And I was like, okay, well, it's in like Larry Fink's hands now. Like people are going to listen to him. We don't need random people like me to be the advocates. Other more important people are taking the reins and they're going to lead Bitcoin to its inexorable destiny, which is a global monetary asset of consequence. All that said, I think what's happening now really reinvigorated me, which I'm very grateful for. Folks like yourself that are taking a fresh set of eyes to the protocol and actually making it something that's useful. So since BitVM V2 or BitVM 1 even came out, I felt so much more optimistic about the future of Bitcoin because I realized it wasn't this sterile thing, this kind of like historical vestige. Like it actually will have a life, and it will succeed. Because I always thought that adding rich state to Bitcoin and increasing economic density by bringing a great variety of new transactions onto Bitcoin was essential, a totally existential question. So I do think it has a second lease on life now, which is nice. But yeah, I think most of my contributions are probably in the past, if I had to guess.
Mm. Well, I love that. I will say that, you are always welcome in the cathedral, but we will keep building whether you continue to lay a few more stones down or not. And I think a lot of us are really grateful for kind of some of the pioneering work that you did and thought pieces you wrote.
Oh, that's very kind of you to say. But I'm glad that there's actual capable people that are building this stuff. I mean, I just write the checks, so that's like the essence of being a VC is you're a cheerleader at best. You maybe help put entrepreneurs in business, but then they actually have to do the work. So we're kind of on the sidelines structurally.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, well, I think that's probably a pretty good way to end it. A nice, good note. Is there anything else that you wanted to cover, maybe share, or should we put a wrap on it?
Um, I don't know, man. That's a good question. I I'm curious on the AI front. Like, do you feel that there's any intersections between AI and crypto at all that are valid? I haven't found anything yet that I like.
Um, in terms of like actual like investable things, no. But like one thing that maybe I'm just like left curving this, but I always thought that there would be a convergence between like validity proofs and these AI models. Because my understanding is that it's essentially a black box. Like, you ask some sort of question, you're like, I kind of know what's going on here, but like, I really don't. And then it spits out an answer. But with a validity proof or, a ZK proof without privacy is essentially the type of proof that we're using to scale Bitcoin. You can, you know, essentially prove the validity of a statement that the computation that was executed in order to get this result, that it followed a certain set of rules. And so why would you not have everything that gets pumped out of an AI model have some sort of validity proof that, I'm oversimplifying this, but it's basically like, hey, like, this isn't me trying to terminate or kill you, Skynet. And you can get mathematical certainty that it actually followed a specific set of rules. That is something that made sense to me. And that's actually something that I think was mentioned by, there's some AI researcher, he might have been on Rogan, Mac, maybe, I don't know. But he kind of like, he was alluding to this idea, and this was right, kind of like when I was starting to understand the concepts of like how we're using validity proofs in Bitcoin. I was like, I think he's describing what we're doing.
Yeah,
So,
the CEO of Anthropic, Dario Amodei, I don't know, I just remember his last name. He went on the Dwarkesh podcast and he said this is a huge open problem in AI, is that they don't have visibility into like what the model is doing, and specifically for alignment purposes. And they were working on this technology to like X-ray the AI to find out what was actually happening inside the model. Was it fulfilling your query the way that you intended it, or is it doing some like sneaky thing where it's pretending to fulfill your query but like conspiring against you? I don't remember what the term was, but my understanding of the IA space is like they have a shockingly limited amount of visibility into what the model is actually doing. So yeah, maybe they need to learn from the crypto people on that.
well, and this is a broader point that we've talked a lot about at Alpin, because like Sims, our CEO, like he was at MIT, like in the early days of AI, and his first company before he started Alpin was, a, computer vision or machine learning, like AI type company. And he sold that to Palantir. So like Sims was on the forefront of this kind of like emerging technology. And he decided to pivot to Bitcoin, which is kind of like crazy to say. And it's like, hey, are you sure? Are you sure you want to do that right now? But I've asked him about this, and he sees it's a really interesting dichotomy that's happening right now, because it's like AI is arguably this, offensive tool that can amass into the hands of few, like the power, aggregates into the hands of few, and that is potentially scary. But cryptography is more of a tool of defense for the masses, something that can like be easily proliferated to all the individuals to protect and ensure that, the way that we use it in cryptography is it ensures authenticity and integrity and potentially privacy. And that can be given to everyone. Like there's no way to like offensively use that. And I think validity proofs, which is just another form of this, like similarly have that power. And so I almost see this as like the new modern day, like philosophical battle. Maybe it's like capitalism versus socialism, or us versus them. It's like, AI versus cryptography. Like I think these powers will kind of like hold each other accountable, and there is potential overlap there.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about the U.S. government's or, U.S. firms spending $500 billion on a cluster, or like China having this industrial policy dedicated to AI, like it's very clear that's power that accrues in the hands of the few at the expense of the many. And crypto is the opposite. So never forget the North Star.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, cool. I think we covered a lot. I think this will be a good one and people will enjoy it. So Nick, I really appreciate you coming on, and hopefully the first of many more.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Glad to be an early guest on here, and good luck with the show.
Awesome. All right. Thank you.